Volume 4 C19. In the heart of Quagoa territory, once the heart of Dwarven territory, the mighty chief inspected their new harvest grounds. Lizards and other creatures tasty to the Quagoa were being raised in captivity for the first time. Revolution. That was the word he heard his people say sometimes as he kept husbanding his people's strength. With food of that sort, in addition to the diet of ores for strong children from capable families, the Quagoa grew stronger every year. Our numbers continued to grow. Peyrero thought with great satisfaction as he passed by one of the dwarf slaves that, clad only in rags, groveled when he passed them by to inspect another pen. This one had bats. Another with a small rodent species. Another pen held actual crops fit for growing inside of a mountain, a delicate moss that took only minimal moisture but turned out to be both tasty and nutritious. The more distant dwarves who tended the crops did not have to stop their work, but they did pause long enough to bow their heads. None of them had beards. Cutting those to shame them turned out to be more effective than I ever dreamed, much like the decision to keep the captives alive to work. It turns out that the humans were right. A good labor force is essential to progress. He mused but kept the thought private. Everybody believed these were only his ideas and his alone. As long as they believe in my infinite wisdom and foresight, half my power base is secure. He disciplined his mind again as his escort took him down the line. The stone road of the once great dwarven city passed between areas that once held houses. Now the buildings were gone, the walls leveled and turned on their sides to create perfect flat surfaces on which to grow crops and raise food. The pasture under the mountain was the next big project. In a few more months, sire, we'll have enough food to lay a full-blown siege on the dwarven capital. As soon as the last outlying settlements are broken on the other side of the gorge, only the capital will remain. We estimate that if we can keep them confined in their city for a period of 6 months, then they will start to starve. We aim to have 1 year's worth of supply prepared before that happens. Their steady feet fell with their waddling gait. At roughly 1.5 meters tall they were not big. Even Peyrero knew the truth that most of his people couldn't admit to themselves. As races of this world go, we are among the weaker ones, not much stronger than humans, and other than high resistance to cutting weapons, we're not greatly more powerful than dwarves. But we can still win. And we will. Even if we must submit to the dragons for now. Something had to be made of that, sooner or later. I need to have our people bred for resistance to breath weapons and tougher hides against claws. With that and our numbers? The chief thought and imagined his Quagoa climbing up the body of a dragon, prying open its scales and tearing its flesh out as it flailed while the things he looked down on devoured him like ants on an injured lizard. The open area had a clear view for a very long way. The shadows cast by captured glowstones were preferable to the light itself, but the slaves needed at least some light to work. So they granted them a bit, though it hurt their eyes enough still, forcing them to squint in the low light. About that, he did not care. Some buildings remained on the fringes, and the chief pointed to one of them. How full! They were the biggest buildings on the fringes, turned into impromptu granaries with preservation magic added to hold lizard meat as well as moss and other foodstuffs kept fresh for later use. Over half right now, my chief. The minor functionary replied and wrung his hands together, bending slightly forward in submission. His pulse throbbed with the hope that his chief would be pleased with their progress. Both of their bellies rumbled at once. Would you like to try some of our meat, my lord? The functionary asked. Yes. Yes, I would, he said, and at a clicking of his claws a dwarf slave jogged over and prostrated himself on the stone. This one begs to know how to please his masters. The dwarf half shrieked. The shaved-faced dwarf had a crisscross of scars on his face. Simply put, he wasn't starved, but he was marked with many scars that proved no magic had been used to heal injuries done to him. Broken, well and truly broken. Peyrero mused with satisfaction. The stumpy ones he kept had a mixed bag of treatment, but all had the rebellion snuffed out of them sooner or later. Food, lizards, be quick about it. The functionary replied, and the dwarf popped up to his feet and jogged away, returning moments later with a dwarven-made stone box holding many fresh, living lizards. The stumpy dwarf grunted and set it down before them, then prostrated himself before the masters to wait in silence while they ate. We'll sit, and take our time. A good meal shouldn't be rushed, and you seem to be doing well. Peyrero added, and a heavy sigh of relief escaped the subordinate. An hour later. Peiriro was salivating over yet another delicious squiggly lizard. It crawled around on his claws, its tiny legs carried it round and round the hand that rotated under it. The lizard reached the end of the furry clawed hand, jumped to the next one, and the chief Peiriro of the Quagoans began the process again. Always the same game, and yet I never tire of it, he thought as the little white legs scrambled along in a desperate bid to escape its fate. The legs were starting to slow. Not by much, but a little bit. Some of his saliva dripped past the gaps in his sharp maw and fell to splash on the little white lizard's back. Its milky eyes were useless, so it had no idea why it was going nowhere. Blind. Blind to its fate. Blind to the game of its captor. The little lizard's tail wiggled. Peiriro traced a single finger claw over its back. The frantic lizard redoubled its efforts, scrambling on one turning hand after the other without ever moving an inch away from the hungry Quagoan chieftain. Almost time, he thought. This one was near the record. 1001, he said in a hoarse whisper. 1002, he added as he rotated his hand again. The little lizard's tiny chest was pounding, its tiny head craned up on the neck. It could hear Peiriro breathing over him. A few feet away from the chief, one of his comrades plucked a wiggling lizard from a box, tossed it into his mouth, and closed his maw, killing the thing instantly. A leg dropped with a wet splat to the stone floor, but the rest of it slid down the other Quagoa's throat easily. 1003, 4, 5, 6, Peiriro said and stopped counting. The lizard collapsed on its belly, its legs no longer moving, its chest pounding, but it could run no more. One more step. You wonder if one more step might have saved you? He thought, and plucked the exhausted lizard up by its tail. It mustered one feeble wiggle, blessedly blind to the sight of the chief's teeth and maw. It still felt the hot breath wafting over it as it was lowered to be tenderly placed on the chief's tongue. With no more strength, it lay limp on the bed of flesh in Peiriro's mouth as the jaw closed, crunched into his limbs and rent his flesh asunder. Not even a single muscle moved as the taste of blood hit Peiriro's tongue and the limbs were severed. The little lizard slid down his throat into his stomach while still alive. It wiggled again, creating a little fluttering tickle in the chief's stomach. Then it stopped moving and did not start again. Delicious, he said, and licked the flecks of lizard blood from his lips to savor every bit of flavor. He might have chosen to indulge in another, but the force of a hurricane wind hit him, nearly knocking him off his feet, and the shadows of the city under the mountain deepened. He glanced up and saw the impossible. Fear. Fear on the face of dragons that were descending to where he stood. His blood ran cold, and he could not look away. Volume 4 C20. Imes landed his mount, and then patted the flanks of the dragon. Stay here. Move as little as possible until someone comes out to greet us. Imes gave the command, and Hedgenmill replied with barely any movement of his mouth. Yes, my lord. They didn't have to wait long. Great bells and drums called the whole city to alarm. I wonder if they consider this to be nighttime or early morning? A minor curiosity of no importance, as he waited and waited while the guards on the wall doubled and redoubled. The stale air under the mountain was tense to say the least, the dwarves in their masses ready with weapons drawn, while Ian sat on an overweight dragon just beyond the reach of any non-enchanted armaments, keeping totally silent. I wonder how long it will be before they send someone out? Ian pondered. It was the more important question by far, compared to his last one. As an undead being, he was fairly sure he wouldn't care, or would have been bold enough to approach the walls himself. But in a human form, his innate shyness asserted itself at the moment of awkwardness. The dwarves Sanbaru described were friendly. This seems less than that. Though he arrived alone and from an unexpected path. What would I think if a stranger showed up flying on dragonback out of nowhere? Nothing good, probably. I should have told Hedgenmill to take the public path, perhaps then I would look less suspicious. I can't criticize him for it, he was trying to please me. At best, I'd be a bad boss if I blamed him now after going along with it. Even if he isn't from Nazarick, I have to set a good example for the children of my friends. Especially Demiurge. Given the things he said before. Ians reprimanded himself in his own heart and decided to treat the awkward moment between himself and the dwarves on the wall as a punishment. A punishment for himself for not properly directing his subordinate, and not thinking about what lay on the other side of that decision. Still the strained moment just kept going. Avashitama, king of the elves, reclined in comfort while an elven woman with a grumbling belly fed him a grape he didn't really care about. "Are you hungry, worthless woman?" he asked with cold, cruel eyes turned up unfeeling to where she stood. She gave a tiny nod. Her once lustrous golden hair was now limp and had split ends. He could see every bruise on her body where he'd hit her before. He stretched out, his broad, powerful body lay over the purple couch with the lower half back that let him prop himself up to a half-seated position. "How long has it been since you've eaten anything, worthless woman?" the Elf King inquired with seeming disinterest. 2 weeks, my king," she replied. It was likely longer. She was more waifish now. Elven women had become broader and hardier thanks to so many of them having at least some of his bloodline added to them over the centuries. Thus they often misjudged the length of time involved in their own suffering, thinking it less time than it truly was. "A pathetic fraction of my power. If I want to rule this world, I need something better than these worthless ones." He felt his loins begin to stir. "Then will you try harder?" he asked of her. "Entice the king and try to bless me with a strong child. And I'll feed you again." This one had held out, if he was any judge, isolated in his palace without the light of the sun, or sight of the moon, for almost 2 months with no food. Her resistance to his advances when he chose her were almost cute. But starvation usually worked. And it did again as her mouth descended to his loins. She held out longer than the last dozen or so. Maybe she'll produce something worthwhile. That made him think of the child he'd lost. The one taken from him. The woman of the theocracy, their trump card. The phrase made him laugh. She'd been tricked, captured, and he'd raped her until she fell pregnant with his child. The fight she'd put up hadn't been a bad one. But even so he made her into a mere broodmare. Until her rescue. His lips curled up in anger so fierce that he ignored the elf woman with her lips around his rod. "The child is mine, they really ought to give her back." The woman was long dead now, and that was a sore point too. "She should have given me dozens of children. Such a waste." That made him think of the woman he now had, and his shaft was now ready for her. He wasted no time. She mounted him and did the frenzied mating act while he reclined and did nothing but wait and watch her body's desperate act. Her stomach rumbled again, and did several more times before he released. King Avashi Terma pushed her off of him the very next moment after it was over, sending her to land with a crumpled thud on the stone floor. "Now get out, go and try to do something useful with my gift. As I am a generous king, I will summon you again. And again. And again. Until your cycle ends. If you fail at your task, I see no reason to waste food on you." She looked up at him with absolute horror on her face. Starvation was a slow and painful way to die. "Regret your stubbornness as you get out," he said, and slapped her as she rose to her knees, sending her tumbling to her back. The angry crack of bone and her sudden cry of pain suggested she was more injured than usual, but the yelp vanished. She scrambled to her feet and ran, leaving only tears in her wake as she was escorted back to holding by a pair of pity-filled guards. Volume 4 C21. Chaos consumed the council chamber of Fioger. Someone flew here on a frost dragon. They can only be working with the Quagua. The Forge Master's meaty fist pounded on the table, his thick lips moved rapidly while he spat out the words. "We should send out guards to drive him away or kill him." "You say that, but he is only sitting there, outside of our reach but in sight of our city, and he's done nothing but that." "Maybe he wants to talk." "He doesn't look like a Quagua, does he?" the far more amiable Minister of Finance pointed out while calmly stroking his thick dark beard. "No," the Minister of War admitted. "No, he doesn't. And the dragon doesn't look like one we're familiar with. Olisar Dark is supposed to be much bigger. This one, everyone says, is kind of fat. This may be an opportunity instead, a chance to form an alliance with someone else." After the initial panic, everyone on the walls has said they feel nothing like hostility. If nothing else, we need to know how they got around the Great Rift without anyone sending word to us. What if there is a hidden passage around it now? The very practical question had a sobering effect on those at the table. "So we send someone out. Ask questions, see what happens." This suggestion was well received. At least, the dwarves nodded with sober appreciation for the needs of the moment for knowledge that they simply did not have. "Fine, we send someone out, we talk to this one. See what happens." Their eldest member said with a grim-spirited smile. "Maybe our luck is about to turn, eh?" A dragon comes to Fear and we're not even frozen or destroyed the moment it does. He let out a laugh that matched the grim smile, and a few of his colleagues let out hesitant and equally dark laughs of their own. Heinz watched the gate slowly open in front of him, not far, but far enough for someone to come out. Only one did, a dwarf in dark clothing that seemed to be of some sort of leather manufacture, but from what source was impossible to say. Not a cow, that's for sure, Heinz thought while he waited. The leather had a very fine shine to it, suggesting that he was quite an important figure. Or does it? How do dwarves dress? He tried to pick through Zanbaru's memories, but what people wore was especially hazy. The lizardman culture wears little to nothing. I suppose this indifference to remembering how the dwarves dress is a natural result. Heinz gave up on figuring that out, and he nearly dismounted from Heginmel when he reminded himself, no, I can't do that. I have to get used to being a king. The dragon mount at least, had not forgotten. With the chats along the way, he knew enough of how to speak of his master, and with his head held high and neck stiff, that he loomed over the dwarf, he spoke. This is His Majesty, King Einzulgaon of the Kingdom of Nazarick. He has come to forge friendly relations of trade with the Kingdom of the Dwarves. The dwarf leaned back and craned his neck upward, his beard so thick and bushy that it was only the movement of his face that made it obvious. The rest of him was essentially hidden. I don't know that kingdom, he said. His back was stiff, his hands were at his sides, but at a glance Heinz felt the dwarf was defensive. Is it that he is immune to my high charisma, or instinctive fear of dragons? Heinz wondered, and considered it was probably a combination of the circumstances plus the dragon of a known enemy acting at least as a temporary debuff. The Kingdom of Nazarick is. Heinz drew himself up, clad in his white robes with their marvelous golden trim, richly dressed and bearing the aura of absolute authority practiced for so very many hours. He recognized he shouldn't say new. Great kings and kingdoms always stood on a foundation of their ancient legacy. So, he lied. Among the most ancient kingdoms of the world. Once, long ago, all the world knew our glory. But, he tried to think, looking away as if remembering, and his voice filled with emotion. We put ourselves to sleep till he stopped, trying to think of a reason, and he plucked one from a quest in the game, to guard against the return of great, destructive forces. We were awakened by the coming of invaders to our sacred home, and so we have rejoined the world again. He pointed down at the dwarf with a white-gloved hand as if accusing him. But you all forgot us. Emotion overloaded Heinz out of almost nowhere. It hit too close to home, to think of everything that he once loved in Yggdrasil, forgotten, cast aside, left to memory and dust, even the memory of his friends. And a wave of grief burst forth like a supernova. The rumbling of majestic power from magic more powerful than the dwarf speaker had felt in all his life, was enough that he fell to his knees and felt no pain under the strain of overwhelming awe. But more than that, was the passionate grief and compassion that was carried in that nova that spread from the center of the soul of the dragon-riding king. I've never met a king. But if you're not one, I'll eat my helmet. The dwarf whispered as the wave of compassion and grief swept over the whole of the dwarven city. For once in his life, Heinz's confidence was as real as the heart in his chest. Over his home, there was never any question, not about what he was, only whether he deserved it or could do it well. But there was no doubt of his station, the burden he bore and which grew with each step forward. I am a king. The king of Nazarick, and I have come with friendly terms to re-establish ancient ties with the dwarven people. He stopped and said, but you are not doing so well these days it seems. If your nation is in need of help. A memory came to mind of a salesman he once knew who, on every call, pretended to be surprised to be speaking with an old friend from school. It made them instantly more friendly. They always played along even after forgetting him, and he was the only one to outsell Suzuki Satoru regularly. Your people were beloved of my kingdom, once. Even if you have forgotten it, he turned his hand up so that the palm was out as if offering something to the dwarf. I would extend that hand of friendship once again. I'm getting to be a better actor little by little. A few key phrases from the Draconic Queen really seemed to do the trick. Heinz mentally praised the foreign monarch while the dwarf shot to his feet. Please. Come with me. At once, your majesty. The dwarf half-shrieked the words with a mix of awe and excitement, his dour attitude completely wiped away. The guards opened the gates which groaned from the effort. The great double-wide barrier to entry became an open invitation. Make way. Make way for the king of Nazarick. The dwarf shouted, send word to the council. Have a reception prepared at once. Make way. Make way. Make way. The dwarves seemed to respect the one who shouted, scrambling to attention and following his directions, and when the dwarf shouted, "Render arms," the dwarves bearing swords, spears, and crossbows snapped to attention, holding their chosen weapon vertically to the ground in front of themselves at the center of their bodies. In this way, under honors, Ainz entered the dwarven capital. That went well, Ainz thought, and kept his sigh of relief confined to his thoughts alone.